The quiet hum of the refrigerator was often the loudest sound in Sarah's meticulously organized kitchen. It was a sound of normalcy, of domesticity, a stark contrast to the cacophony that still echoed in the hidden corners of her mind. For years, that other sound, a chorus of chanting voices, the rhythmic beat of a drum, and the chilling pronouncements of a man she'd once revered, had been her constant companion. Now, 5 years removed from that life, living under an assumed name in a small, unassuming town in Ohio, Sarah had almost convinced herself that the echoes were fading. Almost. She'd chosen this town specifically for its anonymity. No sprawling suburbs, no bustling city center, just tree-lined streets, friendly faces at the local grocery store, and a comforting sense of routine. She worked remotely, a freelance graphic designer, her computer screen a shield against the outside world, a world she still instinctively distrusted. She rarely went out after dark, and even during the day, she was always subtly aware of her surroundings, a habit ingrained by years of living under constant surveillance. Her neighbors knew her as Emily, a quiet woman who kept to herself but was always polite. They commented on her beautiful garden, her friendly wave, the occasional glimpse of a well-behaved golden retriever she'd adopted from a local shelter. They had no idea that Emily was a carefully constructed facade, built to conceal the scars, both visible and invisible, of a life she desperately tried to leave behind. The escape had been harrowing, a desperate nighttime flight fueled by a mix of fear and a sudden, fierce surge of self-preservation. She'd left everything behind: her possessions, her identity, and the only community she had ever truly known. Or so she thought. The first sign that her past was not as far behind her as she hoped was subtle, easily dismissed as coincidence. It was a symbol, a stylized knot carved into the bark of an old oak tree in the park she frequented with her dog, Buster. It was a symbol she hadn't seen in years, one that held a specific and chilling meaning within the community she'd fled, the mark of the shepherds, as they called themselves. Within their insular world, it represented belonging, obedience, and the unwavering gaze of their enigmatic leader, a man known only as the Guide. Sarah stopped dead in her tracks, Buster nudging her hand with his wet nose, sensing her sudden stillness. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drumbeat against the quiet morning air. She stared at the carving, the rough edges of the knot seeming to mock her attempts at freedom. Could it be? Was it possible that after all this time, they had found her? She tried to rationalize it. It was a common symbol, perhaps, a decorative knot with no real significance outside the context she knew. But deep down, a cold dread began to take root. The shepherds were not just any community. They were a tightly knit, deeply indoctrinated group with a reach that had always seemed disturbingly far. They prized loyalty above all else, and those who left were considered not just lost but actively rebellious. Over the next few weeks, the subtle signs continued. A fleeting glimpse of a familiar face in a crowd at the grocery store, a melody hummed by a stranger that was a specific chant from their gatherings, a flyer posted on a community board with a seemingly innocuous image that held a hidden meaning known only to those within the cult. Each instance was like a pinprick, deflating the fragile balloon of her newfound peace. She started to change her routine, avoiding the park, taking different routes to the grocery store, her anxiety growing with each passing day. Sleep became a luxury, her nights filled with vivid, unsettling dreams of shrouded figures and echoing chants. She knew she was becoming paranoid, but the feeling that she was being watched, that unseen eyes were tracking her every move, was becoming overwhelming. One evening, as she was working late, the power flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. The sudden silence, broken only by the frantic thumping of her own heart, was instantly reminiscent of the silent hours the shepherds enforced as a form of spiritual discipline. Her breath caught in her throat. It was just a power outage, she told herself, common enough in a small town. But as she fumbled for her phone, a cold gust of wind rattled the window panes, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she heard a faint whisper outside, her former name carried on the breeze. That night, Sarah knew her carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. The past she had tried so hard to bury was reaching out, its tendrils slowly but surely wrapping around her once more. The escape she had orchestrated with such painstaking detail might have been just the beginning of a much longer and far more terrifying journey. The power returned an hour later, but the darkness it had briefly ushered in lingered in Sarah's mind. The whisper of her old name had been the most chilling incident yet, too specific to be a mere figment of her imagination. She knew, with a growing certainty, that the shepherds were not only aware of her new life but were actively trying to unnerve her. Sleep offered little respite. She dreamt of the community's compound, nestled deep in the isolated hills, the imposing gates, the ever-watchful eyes of the elders. She saw faces she hadn't thought of in years, their expressions a mixture of pity and condemnation. And then there was the guide, his piercing gaze that seemed to see through her very soul, his voice a hypnotic drone that once held her captive. The next day a package arrived. It was a plain brown envelope, no return address. Inside, she found a single photograph. It was a picture of Buster, her golden retriever, taken just that morning in her own backyard. The clarity of the image, the way Buster was looking directly at the camera as if he knew he was being watched, sent a jolt of pure terror through her. This was no coincidence. This was a direct message. They knew her dog, the one constant source of comfort and normalcy in her life. Sarah's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. She called the local police, her voice trembling as she tried to explain her fears, her past. But how do you explain the insidious grip of a cult, the psychological manipulation, the unspoken threats that linger long after you've physically escaped? The officer on the other end of the line was polite but skeptical. A carved knot, a fleeting face, a power outage, a picture of her dog. Individually, they were nothing. Collectively, they were her worst nightmare come true. Frustrated and feeling increasingly isolated, Sarah knew she couldn't rely on anyone else. She had to understand how they had found her, what their intentions were. Her escape 5 years ago had been meticulously planned, involving burner phones, cash transactions, and a circuitous route across several states. She had even changed her appearance, dyeing her once dark hair a lighter shade and adopting contact lenses. How could they have possibly traced her? She started to retrace her steps, her mind racing back to the days and weeks leading up to her departure. Had she made a mistake? Had she confided in someone she shouldn't have? The thought of betrayal, of someone within the community she had trusted having played a part in her recapture, was a sickening blow. As she delved deeper into her memories, a particular incident surfaced. A new member, a young woman named Anya, had joined the community just a few months before Sarah's escape. Anya had seemed lost and vulnerable, and Sarah, despite her growing disillusionment with the shepherds, had felt a pang of sympathy. She had offered Anya small gestures of kindness, a shared smile during meals, a brief word of encouragement during grueling work sessions. Had those innocent interactions been observed, misinterpreted? Had Anya been an informant, planted to identify those who were wavering? The thought was unsettling, but it fit. The shepherds were masters of manipulation, of exploiting vulnerabilities. They had eyes and ears everywhere, even within their own ranks. The possibility that her attempt to offer a simple human connection had inadvertently led them back to her filled Sarah with a bitter sense of regret. Driven by a desperate need for information, Sarah started scouring the internet, searching for any mention of the shepherds, any news articles or online forums that might shed light on their activities. She used anonymous browsers and public Wi-Fi, terrified of leaving a digital trail. What she found was disturbing. Whispers of other former members who had disappeared, cryptic warnings about their long reach, and unsettling accounts of their continued influence despite operating largely in the shadows. One forum, dedicated to survivors of cults, mentioned a specific tactic the shepherds were known for: the slow, psychological unraveling of those who had left. They didn't always resort to immediate violence. Often, their goal was to instill so much fear and paranoia that the former member would either return willingly or live in a perpetual state of terror. This resonated deeply with Sarah's experience. The subtle signs, the photograph, they weren't just threats. They were a way of letting her know that she was never truly free, that their eyes were always on her. Then, buried deep within an obscure online archive, she found it. A news article from years ago detailing the Shepherd's early days, their charismatic founder, and a list of their initial followers. Among the names, one stood out, a name Sarah recognized: Daniel. He had been one of the community's most devoted members, a quiet, unassuming man who had always seemed deeply committed to the guide's teachings. Sarah remembered him vaguely, a peripheral figure in the background of her former life. The article mentioned that Daniel had a background in surveillance technology before joining the Shepherds. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Could he be the one? Could he be the unseen hand orchestrating this campaign of psychological terror? The thought was terrifying, but it also offered a sliver of something else. A potential lead, a thread she could try to follow in the darkness that was closing in around her. Armed with the unsettling information about Daniel, Sarah knew she couldn't stay passive any longer. The psychological games were escalating, and she feared what might come next. She decided to try and find out more about him, hoping to understand his connection to the Shepherds and how he might be involved in her current predicament. Using online databases and public records, Sarah managed to find a recent address for a man named Daniel residing in a neighboring state. The information was sparse, but it was a start. Driven by a mixture of fear and a growing sense of defiance, she decided to take a chance. She packed a small bag, told her neighbor she would be away for a few days, and with Buster riding shotgun, she drove towards the unknown. The address led her to a secluded house on a large, wooded property. It was unassuming from the outside, but there was a sense of quiet surveillance in the air, a feeling of being watched that sent shivers down her spine. She parked her car a safe distance away and approached the property on foot, Buster staying close by her side. As she cautiously made her way through the trees, she noticed a series of small, almost imperceptible cameras hidden amongst the foliage. Her heart sank. This wasn't just a random individual. This was someone with the means and the inclination to monitor his surroundings. It confirmed her suspicion Daniel was likely still connected to the Shepherds, and he was definitely watching. Deciding on a more direct approach, Sarah walked boldly to the front door and rang the bell. A few tense moments passed before the door was opened by a man who fit the description from the old news article Quiet Eyes. A slightly receding hairline, an aura of unremarkable ordinariness that belied the unsettling information she had uncovered. "Yes?" he asked, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I'm looking for Daniel," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "My name is Emily. I believe we might have some acquaintances in common." A flicker of recognition, quickly masked, crossed his face. "I don't think so. You must have the wrong address." He started to close the door. "The Shepherds," Sarah said quickly, the word hanging heavy in the air. "Does that name ring a bell, Daniel?" His reaction was immediate. His body tensed, and his eyes narrowed. He opened the door wider, a dangerous glint in his gaze. "What do you want?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I want to be left alone. I left that life behind, and I have no intention of ever going back. But they keep reaching out." Daniel stepped back, a strange mix of fear and something else, regret, in his eyes. "You shouldn't have come here. Where else could I go?" Sarah retorted. "They're in my home, in my life. I need to know why, and I need it to stop." He hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "Come inside, but be careful what you wish for." Inside, the house was sparsely furnished but filled with an array of electronic equipment. Monitors, servers, a tangled web of wires that snaked across desks and shelves. It was a surveillance hub, exactly as Sarah had feared. Daniel led her to a room dominated by a large screen displaying multiple feeds from hidden cameras, including several angles of Sarah's own home and backyard. The shock was visceral. They had been watching her every move for a long time. "How?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "How did you find me?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He seemed conflicted, his gaze fixed on the screen showing Buster playing in her yard. "It's complicated." "Complicated how?" Sarah pressed. He finally turned to her, his expression grim. "It wasn't Anya. She was just as trapped as you were. The truth is, the guide never lets anyone truly leave. He has methods, connections. He then revealed a shocking secret. Daniel hadn't just been a devoted member. He had been the guide's right-hand man, instrumental in building the Shepherd's infrastructure, including their elaborate surveillance network. He had left the community a few years after Sarah, disillusioned by the guide's increasingly erratic and controlling behavior. But even in his escape, he hadn't been able to sever all ties. The guide, it turned out, had a failsafe. Before Daniel left, he had been forced to install a sophisticated tracking system within Sarah's belongings, a seemingly innocuous item she had carried with her when she fled. It was this tracker, coupled with facial recognition software and a network of informants, that had allowed them to locate her. But there was another, more disturbing revelation. Daniel confessed that he hadn't been the one orchestrating the recent events. The photograph of Buster, the subtle reminders of her past, these were the work of someone else. Someone within the guide's inner circle who knew about Daniel's past connection to Sarah and was using it to manipulate him as well. They wanted Daniel to bring Sarah back, and they were using fear to achieve their goal. "They know about us," Daniel said, his voice laced with fear. "They know I helped you indirectly by leaving. They think I'm still loyal to you, or that I can be." Suddenly, the room was filled with the piercing shriek of an alarm. One of the monitors flickered, displaying a red warning. "They know you're here," Daniel said, his eyes wide with panic. "We have to go." As they scrambled to leave, Sarah realized the horrifying truth. She hadn't just been running from the cult. She had stumbled into a complex web of secrets, betrayals, and power struggles within its very core. Her escape had inadvertently triggered a chain of events that had now put both her and Daniel in mortal danger. The quiet life she had so desperately sought was shattered, replaced by a desperate flight for survival, with the ever-present shadow of the Shepherds looming behind them. The blaring alarm had shattered the tense calm, forcing Sarah and Daniel into immediate action. Daniel, despite his technological expertise, was clearly out of practice with real-world escape scenarios. Sarah, however, carried the ingrained instincts of someone who had lived under constant threat. She knew they couldn't outrun the Shepherds indefinitely, especially now that they knew she was with Daniel. "We need to disappear completely," Sarah said, her voice urgent. "They have eyes everywhere. Your neighbors, the roads. They'll be watching." Daniel nodded frantically, grabbing a backpack filled with cash and a few essential items. "I have a cabin upstate, deep in the woods. It's off the grid. No cell service. No easy way to find it." The drive was nerve-wracking. Every passing car, every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat. Daniel was constantly checking his rearview mirror, his anxiety palpable. Sarah, though equally terrified, tried to remain focused, her mind racing, trying to anticipate their next move. They reached the cabin late that night. It was rustic but secure, nestled in a dense forest miles away from any sign of civilization. For the first time since the nightmares had begun, Sarah felt a sliver of relief. But she knew it wouldn't last. Over the next few days, they laid low, rationing supplies and trying to formulate a plan. Daniel revealed more about the inner workings of the Shepherds, the hierarchy, the unwavering loyalty the guide commanded, and the ruthlessness with which dissent was crushed. He explained that the guide's power wasn't just spiritual. It was built on a foundation of psychological manipulation, financial control, and a network of deeply embedded followers. The individual who had been taunting Sarah was likely someone high up in the organization, someone who knew about Daniel's past and saw him as a potential liability. By targeting Sarah, they were sending a message to Daniel, trying to lure him back into the guide's fold or eliminate him as a threat. One evening, as they were talking, Daniel confessed his deep regret for his role in building the Shepherd's oppressive system. He had initially believed in the guide's message of spiritual enlightenment, but over time, he had witnessed the darkness and the abuse of power firsthand. His escape had been an act of self-preservation, but he knew he could never truly atone for the harm he had caused. Sarah, despite her fear and anger, felt a flicker of understanding. They were both victims in different ways, bound by the shared trauma of their past. Their fragile sanctuary was shattered a week later. Daniel, attempting to get a faint cell signal on a nearby ridge, returned with grim news. He had picked up a local news report about a missing woman from Ohio, a woman matching Sarah's description. Her disappearance framed as suspicious. The shepherds were tightening the noose. They knew they couldn't stay in the cabin. It was only a matter of time before they were found. They needed to take action to expose the guide and his organization. Daniel had an idea. He knew about a former member, someone who had managed to escape years ago and had gone on to build a new life, albeit in constant fear. This person had gathered evidence of the guide's abuses and might be willing to help them. Contacting this former member was a risky endeavor, but they had no other options. Using an old satellite phone Daniel had stored at the cabin, they managed to reach out. The response was hesitant but ultimately hopeful. The former member, a woman named Eleanor, agreed to meet them at a secure location several states away. The journey was fraught with tension, but they managed to avoid detection. Eleanor, a hardened woman with wary eyes, listened intently to their story. She confirmed their fears about the guide's reach and the danger they were in. She also revealed a crucial piece of information: an upcoming gathering of the shepherds at their main compound, a rare event that drew all the key members together. This was their chance. With Eleanor's connections and Daniel's insider knowledge, they devised a plan to infiltrate the compound, gather irrefutable evidence of the guide's criminal activities, and expose him to the authorities. It was a dangerous, almost suicidal mission, but it was their only hope of finally breaking free. The infiltration was a tense, adrenaline-fueled nightmare. They moved through the shadows, Daniel disabling security cameras and guiding Sarah through the labyrinthine corridors of the compound. They found the room Eleanor had told them about, a hidden office where the guide kept records of his financial dealings, his manipulation tactics, and the names of influential individuals he had compromised. As Daniel worked to copy the files onto a portable drive, they were discovered. The alarm blared, and they were surrounded by loyal followers, their faces contorted in fanatic devotion. A chaotic confrontation ensued. Daniel, surprisingly agile, fought back with a ferocity born of desperation. Sarah, drawing on a strength she didn't know she possessed, defended herself alongside him. In the midst of the chaos, they saw him, the guide, his eyes burning with cold fury. He pointed directly at Sarah. "You will never escape," he hissed, his voice echoing through the compound. But this time Sarah didn't flinch. She had faced her fear, and she was no longer the terrified young woman who had fled in the night. Just as the situation seemed direst, the sound of sirens filled the air. Eleanor, anticipating trouble, had alerted the authorities. The compound was swarming with law enforcement. The guide was apprehended, his reign of terror finally brought to an end. The evidence Daniel and Sarah had risked their lives to obtain was enough to launch a full-scale investigation into the shepherds and their activities. In the aftermath, Sarah, no longer Emily, began the long and arduous process of reclaiming her life. The scars of her past would always remain, but now they were a reminder of her resilience, her courage to face her demons and fight for her freedom. Daniel, facing his own legal repercussions for his past involvement, vowed to cooperate fully with the authorities and work towards dismantling the organization he had once helped build. The story of Sarah's escape and the darkness that followed her home serves as a chilling reminder of the insidious nature of cults and the enduring impact they can have on their victims. It highlights the importance of vigilance, the strength of the human spirit, and the hope that even in the darkest of circumstances, freedom is possible. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, please give it a like. Subscribe to our channel for more gripping narratives, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you don't miss our next video. Share this story with anyone you think might find it interesting. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to light. We appreciate you being a part of our community. Until next time, stay safe.